Good morning. Welcome to today's morning meditation, and I think you're going to find this fascinating. I know I do. We're in Isaiah chapter 45, and I've been saying this every day now, but please go back and read the entire chapter. They're just filled with so many amazing things. This chapter begins talking more about Cyrus that we talked about yesterday, how God had called him by name and what he was going to do 150 to 200 years before he was even on the scene. And the first part of chapter 45 talks more about Cyrus and that very, very specific prophecy. But in verses 6 and 7, still referring to Cyrus, he makes a comment about him being the Lord and that there isn't any beside him. So let's just read these verses and jump right in. Isaiah 45 verses 6 and 7 from the New King James Version, it says, "That they may know from the rising of the sun to its setting that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is no other. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create calamity. I, the Lord, do all these things." I don't know if it hits you like it hits me when I read these verses. Not that there isn't any other God beside our God. I'm okay with that. The part that gets me is when he talks about forming the light and creating the darkness. Okay, no problem there. But I make peace and create calamity or create disasters. And that's challenging for me. God is basically saying here that he sends the times of peace and the times of prosperity and all the good things, but he also sends not only little of adversities, but calamities. When we see earthquakes and floods, when we see horrendous things, God is allowing them to happen and sometimes directly causing them to happen according to his perfect will. And that's hard for me to understand because I always associate God with love, God with goodness, God with mercy. I associate them with him not because I'm an optimist, but because God says that they are the characters of his personality. He is love. He is truth. He is goodness and he is kindness. And if that's who he is, how do we reconcile that with a God who also creates calamity? It's a hard one to understand because seeing the situation, we don't understand why we would ever or why God would ever allow calamities to occur. And we see so many of them in the Bible themselves. You read through the book of Revelation and you look at the tribulation period and it's full of calamities and it's part of God's judgment on the world. And part of it is judging those that are staunchly opposed to God and are entrenched in their sin and unwilling to repent. Part of it is so that many people in that day could have an opportunity to hear the gospel and get saved. But the real answer is I don't always understand why God does the things that he does. I don't understand sometimes when people who love God and are following God have calamity come in their life. You could always rationalize it in saying God, is building faith. And he does through adversity. But in the midst of it, it seems so unfair. And it's in those instances that I always have to come back and remember that I don't see the full picture, but God does. We get a good look at this in the book of Job in the Bible. Job was a man who feared God and was righteous. And God allows him to be tested severely. He even calls him to Satan's attention and says, "What do you think of my servant Job? He's upright in his whole generation. There's nobody like him." And Satan goes on to persecute him with God's permission, destroying his wealth, killing his children, and afflicting his body with painful boils and sores. And God allows it to happen. And in the end, when Job has been complaining that this is unfair, and God appears to him to speak to him, God never gives Job a reason why. He basically just says to Job, I'm God, and who are you to counsel me on what I should do? And in the end, that's really the only appropriate answer that God could give. Because God is working out so many things in such an unbelievable scale that even if he told us what he was up to, I don't think we could comprehend it. We see the physical world around us. We see his creation. We've been studying it for centuries upon centuries. And what we find out every time we look into things is once we think we know it, we find out there's a whole nother level, a whole nother set of questions, a whole nother level of complexity that we never even considered. And we're amazed all the time by just how detailed and amazing this creation is. It's beyond our comprehension, much of it. And I think God's use of peace and calamity, how he lets that fold out, is also in many instances above our ability to conceive it here and now. But what we can get a hold on is God's love and God's character. And we can come to a place of trusting, like Abraham did. When God told him to sacrifice his son, his only son Isaac, Abraham brought him to the place and was ready to plunge the knife down, and God stayed his hand. And later on in the book of Hebrews, it talks about Abraham. And it talks about that he had so much faith that he believed if God allowed him to destroy this son, this was the son of the promise through which the Messiah would come, that God would just raise him up from the dead, that God was not limited. And he believed that because he knew God, and he knew that he keeps his promises, and he knows that he's good, even though he couldn't understand how this was beneficial to slay his son. He trusted God in the midst of it. Now we can look back and understand what a beautiful picture that was of the Messiah who would come. Abraham was willing to give his son. God said, no, you don't have to. But it gave us a picture of God giving up his only son to die for the sins of the world. So I want you to think about this. Our God is the one who makes peace and creates calamity. And in the midst of that, when the unbelievable happens, when the difficult day comes, what I want you to hang on to is the heart of God, who promises to love you and give you grace in spite of the circumstances. And one day, I believe, in heaven, God will look back at our life and show us the reasons why even the difficult things had to happen. And I'm sure we'll say, Lord, it was perfect, your plan. But until that time, don't try to figure out the whys. Concentrate on the who. Have a great day. Bye.